Whether it's the missing loot from a heist that was carried out long ago, paintings that have gone missing, or strange artifacts that defy belief, history is filled with inexplicable events that are yet to be explained. Historians are constantly trying to solve these mysteries, and with time, they might finally be able to put some of these cases to rest. Just about everyone in the world suffers from some type of phobia, whether it's considered to be a rational fear or not. Anyone can understand a person being afraid of heights or narrow spaces, but some phobias seem to defy belief. For example, thousands of people suffer from the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of their mouth. And I'm not just talking about dreading it either. These people suffer from a medically diagnosable, life-changing fear. Some sufferers are able to eat very small amounts of peanut butter, but for the most part, they avoid going anywhere near it. One very modern fear is called nomophobia, the fear of suddenly realizing that your cell phone is missing. It also includes an extreme fear of your phone running out of battery or having no cell service. While this fear can be rationalized in emergency situations, it's believed to mostly affect individuals who are addicted to their phones, since they're worried about missing out on an event or not having contact with someone. Then there's optophobia, which is the fear of opening one's eyes. This is often mentioned in the same context as agoraphobia, which is the fear of open spaces, since sufferers often choose to remain indoors or in darkened rooms. Some of us may see these phobias as ridiculous, but they are very real, as is another fear called radiophobia. This is the fear of ionizing radiation, and it's caused many people to struggle with their daily lives since the Chernobyl disaster. One of the major issues for sufferers of radiophobia is that the radiation is invisible, and hence they never know whether they're in danger or not. This often causes them to assume the worst, and it starts affecting their daily routines and eventually their lives as a whole. One example of this was recorded in a medical journal after a child visited a hospital and was found to need x-rays after breaking his leg. After this was done, he was returned to his mother, but she was unable to touch her own child since she suffered from radiophobia and was convinced the child had become dangerously radioactive as a result of the x-ray. The doctor who had taken the x-ray explained that as soon as the machine was turned off, any radiation that was present dissipated almost immediately, and there was no danger to her son. Many people who are affected by the phobia aren't as concerned with the radiation itself, but the effects that it could have. It's known that radiation can cause cancer in some people who've been exposed to it, and so sufferers fear that they've already received a high dose of radiation, and that it's only a matter of time until they start noticing the symptoms of cancer. Some people suffer flare-ups of the phobia, for instance, when they hear about an accident at a nuclear plant, or when there's talk about nuclear weapons being constructed. But for others, it becomes permanent, and it's often a debilitating way of life. Many cases were reported in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, and after the accident at the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan in 2011, experts have stated that these fears are usually due to an overestimation of the dangers of radiation. But that fact doesn't make the fear any less real, no matter how irrational it may seem to the rest of us. One would imagine that when criminals are planning a daring heist, they take every possible scenario into account so that they can get away with their crime. But in one case that took place in 2017, during a robbery that was carried out in Berlin, Germany, the thieves left a trail of clues behind, and they were eventually apprehended, but their haul has never been recovered. On the 27th of March that year, Ahmed and Wissam Renmo, who are cousins, were aided by a security guard called Dennis W., a longtime friend who was working as a security guard at the Bode Museum. He'd only been working at the museum for a month when the trio decided to stage a daring heist. They broke one of the building's windows to gain entry, and once inside used a skateboard and wheelbarrow to steal a 220-pound commemorative gold coin, known as Big Maple Leaf. The coin was minted in 2007 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Canada's annual Gold Maple Leaf Bullion coin series, and it was put on display in the museum. It was estimated to be worth around $4.3 million, and somehow the three criminals managed to remove it from the building before fleeing. When CCTV footage from the area was checked, though, The three men were seen walking the same route the night before while dressed in black clothing. Once they were detained, Wassam's phone was checked, and searches for how to break down large amounts of gold were discovered. When their getaway car was searched, investigators found small particles of gold that led them to believe that the coin had been melted down and that those pieces may have been sold. When Wassam's apartment was searched, the police found a rare Armani jacket that he could be seen wearing in the security footage from the night before the heist was carried out. This, along with glass from the broken window that was found on a pair of gloves, was the last clue needed to seal the robbers' fates. At their trial, it was revealed that Dennis had started spending large amounts of money after the robbery. He purchased expensive cars and jewelry, something that his fellow robbers must not have been very happy about. He was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in jail, along with the $108,000 fine. As for the two cousins, they were each handed sentences of 4.5 years behind bars and will need to repay the value of the coin, $4.3 million. But that coin has never been found. One major issue that had to be dealt with during cleanup operations at Chernobyl was what to do with the tons of radioactive material that were strewn around the area. These objects were incredibly dangerous and could even today lead to someone losing their lives if they were to come into contact with them. For example, the uniforms worn by first responders, mostly firefighters, were left in the basement of the Pripyat hospital, and these items will remain there for many more years since they remain extremely irradiated. But not too far from the plant lies an area that's even more hazardous, and which will remain untouched for what's predicted to be thousands of years to come. When the citizens of Pripyat were evacuated, they were forced to leave without most of their personal possessions, including their vehicles. These cars, trucks, buses, and vans had become irradiated and were no longer safe to be around, but they couldn't simply be left where they were. Hence, the decision was made to move them to what's now become known as the Vehicle Cemetery, which is located just outside the city. While these vehicles are certainly dangerous, those that were used during rescue and cleanup operations are even more hazardous, since they were driven right up to the plant and would have been subjected to unthinkable amounts of radiation. These included fire trucks, ambulances, tanks, and normal vehicles driven by people who'd been ordered to assess the situation at the plant. But when all was said and done, it became clear that these vehicles had to be removed from the area and placed somewhere where they would not be a hazard to anyone. If left unchecked, this would cause further contamination, and so a drastic plan was put into motion. All of these vehicles were driven into a field in the village of Burykivka, which was situated about 7 miles from the plant where they were parked, never to be seen again. Before the disaster, the village was home to just over 220 people, but they were all forced to evacuate, and it now no longer appears on the register of settlements, as if it never existed in the first place. Before these vehicles were moved there, about 30 trenches were dug in the field, and much of the radioactive material that was collected was dumped in and covered up with soil. The vehicles were then moved into the field, where they remained for many more years. The site remains a popular tourist attraction, despite the fact that the vehicles have been removed, and it's still situated in the exclusion zone. John Dillinger will forever remain one of the most famous and cunning criminals in American history. He got into trouble often from an early age while growing up in Mooresville, Indiana, and he eventually dropped out of school. As an adult, he joined the U.S. Navy, but after serving just a few months, he deserted. In 1924, he attempted to rob a grocer's in Mooresville, but he was caught, arrested, and then sentenced to prison for several years. He was paroled in 1933, and having learned about bank robbery from his fellow inmates, he and 4 other men started robbing banks in Ohio and Indiana. They managed to rob 5 banks in just 4 months, always dressed well, according to witnesses. Later that same year, he was imprisoned again, but 5 men managed to free him from his cell after ending the life of a local sheriff. They then continued their string of robberies in Wisconsin and Indiana, but they were caught up with in Tucson, Arizona. Given his history, Dillinger was sent to the escape-proof Crown Point Jail in Indiana, but there he used a blade and a piece of wood to create a fake firearm that he then blackened using shoe polish. With the fake weapon in hand, he made it out of the prison and is said to have been singing as he made his escape. He then stole the sheriff's car and traveled to Chicago. He became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, but in the meantime, he and his accomplices continued robbing banks as far as they went. After a few close calls, he underwent plastic surgery to change his appearance. But back in Chicago, he and his girlfriend had become friendly with a brothel owner named Anna Sage. She, along with the FBI and Indiana police, set a trap. The three went to see a screening of the film Manhattan Melodrama at the Biograph Theater, and when they emerged, the FBI was waiting outside. He attempted to flee, but a firefight ensued, and his life was ended, bringing his long crime spree to an end. Some people believe that he got away, and that another man was mistakenly fired at, but his fingerprints proved that he was indeed Dillinger. But one mystery surrounding Dillinger remains unsolved. According to one legend, after a shootout with the FBI on one occasion in 1934, Dillinger managed to flee while carrying a suitcase containing $200,000 in cash. At the time, he and his accomplices were hiding out in Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin, and upon making it out of the firefight, he traveled north of the lodge, where he buried the suitcase with the cash still inside. It's said that he was never able to retrieve it since he lost his life just 3 months later, and ever since, treasure hunters have been searching for the suitcase's location. Some people also believe that the loot from one of these robberies is buried somewhere on Pierpont Farm. Some believe that the haul was eventually found and never reported, while some rumors state that it's buried somewhere in the woods, waiting to be uncovered. Many people who are familiar with the Chernobyl incident are shocked to learn that the disaster of 1986 wasn't the first accident to occur at the plant, but this has been confirmed by KGB documents that have been declassified after being kept a secret for decades. The newly released papers date back to well before the disaster, as far back as 1970, and a total of 190 different documents have been made available to the public. Some of the details that have now come to light are startling, to say the least. We now know that officers from the KGB and the SSR in Ukraine were tasked with keeping the Chernobyl plant safe, but they seemingly had other things on their mind. They were far more interested in fleshing out representatives of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, as well as German and Chinese agents. At the time, it was believed that each of these groups had hatched a plan to destroy the plant at Chernobyl, though no evidence has been found to support this. But they did not completely neglect their duties. They were also tasked with inspecting any materials that were shipped to the plant, particularly those that were used in its construction. According to the released documents, they repeatedly found problems with these materials and reported these shortcomings, and those in power in Kiev tried to rectify this. But the higher-ups in Moscow decided that these issues should simply be ignored. The result should have been predictable, but nothing more was done. As a result, the plant experienced as many as 8 different accidents between 1971 and 1981, some of which were because of operation error, but the majority of these accidents were caused by inferior building materials. In 1984, 2 years before the disastrous accident, the KGB did its best to make its concerns known and reported that the Chernobyl plant was an accident waiting to happen, as they had detected issues with the reactor core. But again, they were not taken seriously, and their plans fell on deaf ears. The plant was run in an environment of producing results, rather than following the correct procedures, and as a result, many of the operators ignored what they had learned during their training, in order to produce what was perceived as impressive results. As an example, one operator at the plant decided to catch a few fish in a nearby pond, which was known to be irradiated. He then sold the fish to people living in the area. This was unbelievably irresponsible, and the KGB reported this to Moscow, but they were ignored. In the days following the explosion, members of the KGB who were present reported that the accident had been staged in an effort to distract the Soviet Union citizens from the many other problems they were experiencing. These claims were investigated, but they were found to be unproven, and the government decided the meltdown had occurred due to mistakes made by the operator, rather than looking further into the possibility that it was caused by inferior building materials. It's somewhat ironic that a large amount of gold that has never been discovered is said to be located somewhere in the Superstitious Mountains in Arizona. The legend of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine started in the 1870s when a prospector called Jacob Waltz made a startling revelation. Waltz was a very experienced miner, and according to those who knew him, he had a superior knowledge of geology. He arrived in Arizona in the 1860s, after which he started looking for gold veins in the mountains. Sometime in the 1870s, he's said to have come across a massive vein that would have made him a very rich man, but he kept the location of the gold a closely guarded secret. One account claims that he once sold $250,000 worth of gold to the U.S. Mint, though some historians claim that this was actually done by another man, while others believe the account to be fictional. Whatever the case may be, it was reported that Waltz would often be seen in Phoenix with his saddlebags packed to the brim with gold he'd removed from his private mine. People would ask him where he found it, but he would always remain evasive and give false directions to the mine. As is to be expected, many people tried to follow him to the mine whenever he set out to fetch another haul, but he was an experienced outdoorsman and would easily lose them before traversing the mountains back to his mine. Since he had traveled the route so many times, he knew how to get rid of anyone who was tailing him. Waltz eventually bought a homestead near Phoenix, and when he was in his 80s, he decided that the mine should be hidden. According to some accounts, he traveled to the mine one last time, and upon his arrival, dug a 6-foot hole near its entrance. He then covered it with 2 ironwood logs, which were then covered with soil and rocks. He claimed that the entrance to the mine was so well hidden that someone could walk or drive right over it without ever realizing that they were standing on the precipice of untold riches. In 1891, Waltz's homestead was decimated by a flood, and as a result, he fell ill with pneumonia. Despite the efforts of a nurse to treat him, he eventually passed away and took the location of the mine to his grave. Before his passing, he stated that at least $20 million worth of gold was left in the mine, but he did leave a clue as to its location. He stated that from the entrance he could see the military trail, but added that the mine could not be seen from that trail. He added that the trail of the mine isn't straightforward and that it contains some kind of trick to finding the entrance. Further clues state that it's located in a north-trending canyon, that he could see Weaver's Needle from the mine, and that there's a rock face somewhere along the correct trail. But many people believe that these clues were intentionally misleading, since Waltz never intended for the mine to be found. Occurred. It didn't take long for residents to realize that no event of equal magnitude had ever taken place on our planet. Plans had to be formulated on the fly, and in many instances no one knew whether they would be effective, since no such measures had ever been needed before. Thanks to the gravity of the situation, many people started looking to the Bible for answers, and a startling discovery was made. The name Chernobyl is made up of 2 words, chemi, which translates to black, and bil, which in English means herb or stalk. There's an abundance of a plant called blackweed or black wormwood in the area, and it's this name that caused a stir among theologians and those with a good knowledge of the Bible, since wormwood is mentioned in the book's prophecies. The passage in question comes from the 10th and 11th verses of the book of Revelation, chapter 8, and it reads, quote, "The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter." Remarkably, on the 25th anniversary of the disaster, a statue was erected at the old town of Chernobyl. It features a figure called the Third Angel that was placed at the entrance of Chernobyl's Wormwood Star Memorial Complex, with the trumpet held up to its lips as if it were preparing to signal an incoming disaster. Whether this name was purposefully chosen to align with the prophecy remains unknown, but it's caused many people to start dreading what they believe to be the approaching end of the world. They've also pointed out that the prophecy mentions a star that burns like a torch, which they equate to the burning of the reactor core, that at first seemed to have been contained, but then suddenly worsened. Next, they note that the groundwater close to the plant flows very close to the surface, and that the nearby river Dnieper is the largest surface water system in all of Europe. In the wake of the disaster, there were fears that the reactor would burn down into the water table, and if this had happened, all of this water would have become radioactive and unsuitable to drink, leaving millions of people without a source of fresh water. When the Soviet Union started implementing nuclear power, it believed it would help turn around the stagnating economy, and the power plants were referred to as shining stars across the USSR. Some people believe that this is due to the fact that the nuclear reaction inside the core is similar to that of what occurs inside of a star. Furthermore, when the core exploded, it's estimated to have burned at around 8,400 degrees Fahrenheit, not much less than the temperature of our nearest star, the Sun. It's said that a treasure was being transported on a ship called the San Miguel in 1715, and it might be one of the biggest lost treasures of all time, and it's waiting to be discovered somewhere close to Amelia Island off the coast of Florida. On the 31st of July that year, the Spanish galleon was on its way from Havana, Cuba, and headed to Spain, along with the fleet of 11 other ships, known as the 715 Plate Fleet. But they were not far into their journey when they sailed into a massive storm that caused 11 of the ships to go under. The San Miguel was also badly damaged, and according to one report, it was last seen sailing in a northerly direction past St. Augustine, but it was noted that it no longer had a mast, which left it at the mercy of the sea and the elements. As many as 900 sailors lost their lives in the storm, and with so many ships going under at the same time, it's believed that the area contains a massive amount of treasure. Hence, it's now known as the Treasure Coast. According to witnesses, no one aboard the San Miguel survived, and hence it was sailing unmanned. Records have it that the San Miguel was sailing as the fleet's register ship, which means that it was licensed to haul away very valuable cargo. It's been suggested that among its cargo, it was carrying the Queen's dowry, a massive amount of gold and silver, as well as gemstones, spices, and tobacco. Needless to say, the prospect of finding the treasure has lured many fortune seekers to the coast in hopes that they will be able to recover it. But despite the best efforts of human hunters over the centuries, no one has been able to locate it, though it's thought that some expeditions have come close. In 2007, a group of divers came across a cannon on the sea floor that's believed to have belonged to the San Miguel. When the discovery was reported, thousands of people took an interest in the treasure, which is believed to be worth millions of dollars, and many have since traveled to the area in hopes of striking it rich. But searching for the treasure is easier said than done. The sea floor in the area is known to be hard to traverse, and since no one is certain exactly where the vessel went under, the search area is massive. In 1975, 22 gold coins were found close to Amelia Island, and later 11 more were discovered close by. These pieces of the treasure were found after storms hit the coast, which likely caused the coins to be lifted from the sand under which it was buried. One man didn't have to go to that much trouble though, as he found 15 coins while walking on the beach of Little Talbot Island in 1989. Later that same year, 28 more coins were found on the same beach, and throughout the years, small pieces. Most of us have dreamed about stumbling across a great treasure that no one knew about, and that would change our lives forever. But most of us know this is nothing more than a wild fantasy. But there are thousands of professional treasure hunters around the world who search for rumored treasures that have either been lost or concealed so well that they've never been unearthed. One such cache was known as the Yanganates treasure, and has been the subject of much debate as some people doubt its very existence. The mystery of the treasure began in the 1530s, when the Incan emperor Atahualpa and his brother Huascar were embroiled in a civil war against each other. The Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro saw this as an opportunity, and in 1532 he invaded the Incan Empire, and in the process imprisoned Atahualpa and Cajamarca. The emperor was desperate to regain his freedom, and so he started bargaining with his captor, offering him great riches in the form of Incan gold in return for his release. The deal was made, and after the emperor was released, he ordered General Rumiñahui to start collecting gold from all over the Incan Empire. He managed to gather as much as 750 tons of gold and sent word to Pizarro that the treasure would be delivered to him shortly. But Pizarro grew suspicious that it was all an elaborate ploy to rescue Atahualpa, and before the gold was delivered, he had the emperor executed. Unbeknownst to Pizarro, the gold was very real, and the deal was now no longer an option. Rumen Yahui wanted to be certain that the gold wouldn't make its way into Pizarro's hands, and so he decided to hide it from him. He traveled to the north of Ecuador, now known as the Llanganates, where the gold was secreted. Rumen Yahui was eventually taken prisoner by Pizarro's men, and despite being treated viciously, he refused to reveal the location of the treasure. He eventually passed away without ever revealing its location. Back in those days, the area was completely uninhabited, and today very few people dared to venture there, since the terrain in the mountain is known to be extremely difficult to traverse. The area lies on the cusp of the Avenue of Volcanoes and is known to see a massive amount of rainfall every year. Furthermore, it's often covered in a dense mist that can easily cause an adventurer to fall into a crevice, river, or swamp. Nevertheless, some treasure hunters find the prospect of finding 750 tons of gold too alluring to ignore, and every year, many travel into the mountains in hopes of finding it. It's said that at least 3 people knew the exact location of the treasure. Decades later, when Jose Valverde got married to a woman from Latacunga, the woman's father revealed the location of the gold to him as a wedding present. As a result, Valverde lived his life as a very rich man, and before he passed away, he wrote a guide which translates to Valverde's route. The guide was given to the King of Spain, who then sent an expedition into the mountains to retrieve it, but it could not be located, and one man lost his life in the swamps. No records have been found of further efforts to retrieve the gold, but in 1850, botanist Richard Spruce stumbled across the tale of the hidden treasure while he was conducting research into malaria treatments in Ecuador. More than 3 decades later, treasure hunter Barth Blake claimed to have found the cache, which he claimed contained gold statues of animals, humans, and flowers. He planned to return for the treasure, but while sailing to New York, he mysteriously disappeared and was never seen again. As unlikely as it may seem, the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant has become a tourist attraction to those who dare to venture there. Though many areas still remain off-limits, and visitors must be escorted by a guide at all times. Those who have visited the area describe the atmosphere as eerie and almost ghostly, mostly due to Pripyat and the surrounding areas having stood empty for decades. But it's not only the silence and emptiness that have contributed to the darker legends of Chernobyl, as many people have reported seeing some very strange things in the years that have passed. One of the better-known instances of this concerns a creature that's been dubbed the Black Bird of Chernobyl. Workers of the plant spotted this massive winged creature just days before the explosion at the plant took place. They described it as black in color with red glowing eyes and the body of a human. Many people who heard about this have speculated it might be the Mothman, a similar creature that's been spotted around the world right before disasters, such as bridge collapses and massive earthquakes occur. Workers stated that it had a wingspan of at least 20 feet, and in the days that followed, they were plagued by nightmares and threatening phone calls from people unknown. They added that in the days leading up to the disaster, these dreams and calls intensified, but then disappeared after the core exploded. In an equally terrifying incident that took place in 1997, a nuclear scientist from the University of Buffalo, Andrei Korsakov, had traveled to Chernobyl to take readings, but what he found there instead left him baffled and terrified. On that morning, he wanted to arrive at the plant early, and at around 7:30 a.m., he made his way to the reactor building. He had just started taking some readings when, to his surprise, he heard someone calling for help as a fire had broken out, and they were struggling to contain it. The calls were barely audible, but he heard them several times and he ran to get help. He reported what he had heard to the people who let him in, but they informed him he was the first person to enter that area in over 3 years, that there was no fire, and that no one else could have possibly been in the area at that time. Furthermore, anyone who wishes to enter that area is required to use their palm print as a password, and if anyone had entered without permission, an alarm would have been triggered. This strange event has never been explained. Leda and the Swan is a poem written by William Butler Yeats, in which he tells the story of a famous Greek myth. The tale depicts the god Zeus, who's transformed himself into a swan in order to get closer to a human woman called Leda. By the end of the tale, Leda bears Zeus's child, Helen, who's remembered for the fall of Troy and for indirectly causing the demise of King Agamemnon. It served as inspiration to many artists through the centuries, including Michelangelo, but his depiction of the poem is at the center of an ongoing mystery. It all started when the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso I, took the opportunity while visiting Rome in 1512 to watch Michelangelo while he was working on the Sistine Chapel vault. He was left captivated by what he saw, and by all accounts it left a lasting impression on him. Then, in 1527, Emperor Charles V invaded Rome, and as a result, Pope Clement VII hid in Castel Sant'Angelo to evade capture or worse. 2 years later, the Pope would aid Clement VII in retaking the city, after which Michelangelo was given the title of the General Governor and Procurator of the fortifications of Florence. This meant that he would be responsible for fortifying the city, but he had very little knowledge on the subject, and so he was sent to Ferrara, where he learned about fortification and defense from Alfonso I. When his task was complete, Michelangelo got ready to leave, but before his departure, Alfonso commissioned a painting from him, and the artist readily agreed. Once he was back in Florence, he started work on the city's defenses, while also working on a new painting, Leda and the Swan. We know this to be true thanks to an engraving made by Cornelis Boos, who was a master of art in his own right. Interestingly, the engraving shows Leda in the same pose as another of Michelangelo's works, which is called Night, and unsurprisingly, he was working on these two pieces at the same time. It's said that he used a model for the initial drawings for the painting, and that he was actually a man, Antonio Mini, whose features were later feminized, as was a common practice among artists at the time. In 1530, the painting was finally completed, but Alfonso sent a messenger who told the artist that the Duke wanted to see the piece before accepting it and paying the agreed-upon price. This understandably irked Michelangelo, and matters were made worse by the messenger's comment that the painting was only a, quote, little thing. As a result, Michelangelo dismissed the messenger and voided the deal between him and Alfonso, who likely never even got to see it. By this point, Antonio Mini was working as Michelangelo's apprentice, and he was given the task of looking after the painting. It's been suggested that the painting was actually given to him, since he had two sisters who'd not yet gotten married, and if Mini were to sell the painting, the money he received would bring much-needed relief to his financial situation. Mini left Florence with the painting in hand in 1531, and he set out for France. From here, the details of the fate of the painting remain somewhat murky. One version of events has it that the King of France bought it from Mini, and it was being kept at the palace of Fontainebleau. But this has never been confirmed, and to this day the fate of the painting remains unknown. Efforts were made to restore a copy of the piece, which was created by Rosso Fiorentino, and which is still held at the National Gallery today. Through the years, historians have attempted to track it down, but to no avail, as no one is certain exactly when it was lost, and its location remains one of the art world's most baffling mysteries. Dire consequences following the Chernobyl disaster, and that many of them would only become apparent many years later. They speculated about spikes in cancer diagnosis, people suffering from radiation sickness, and the effects that it would have on close-lying areas, such as the town of Pripyat. It was also known that further-lying countries would be affected in some way, but the residents of the town of Novozhivkov in Russia must have thought they were safe, since the town is located more than 100 miles from the site of the explosion. Mere days after the accident, many residents of Novozhivkov were rehearsing for their May Day parade during cloudy conditions. Suddenly, it started pouring down with rain, and the participants scrambled for cover. It seemed like any other cloudburst, but they could not have known that this downpour was far more dangerous. The following day, Sergei Sizov, a professor at a teacher training college, was in the midst of a lecture on how to detect and respond to a nuclear or chemical attack by enemy forces. This may sound strange to us, but at the time, this was something everyone in the Soviet Union had to learn. In order to learn how to do this, his students had to be taught how to read a military-grade Geiger counter, which measures ionizing radiation in the atmosphere. Sizov expected to switch the machine on and receive normal background radiation readings, but he could not have been more wrong. To his surprise, the counter jumped to levels that he'd only read about in nuclear attack textbooks, and he immediately knew something was wrong. He decided to contact the local civil protection headquarters to report what he had discovered, but they refused to believe him, stating these readings were not possible. At the time, Novozibkov was still an antiquated town, and his residents were mostly farmers who lived in wooden houses and relied on the land to survive. They would have had no idea that the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl had been exposed, not only because they lived 100 miles away, but also because the Soviet government hadn't made an admission yet. Novozibkov and the surrounding region are home to about 200,000 people, and it was found that the entire area had been affected by as much as 5 microsieverts per hour, though that number has since dwindled to 2 microsieverts. Nevertheless, any reading above 0.6 microsieverts per hour renders an area unfit for human habitation, and it's been estimated that several areas like this will be uninhabitable until at least 2176. The residents of Novozibkov were caught in the rain that day and could not have known that they were being drenched in radioactive water. And while there were very few immediate effects, worrying signs would start to emerge years later. Children were born with strange abnormalities, such as underdeveloped ears, for which they needed to undergo several surgeries. At that time, about 1,000 people lived in the area, but they all had to be evacuated in the wake of the disaster, and the entire town was demolished to ensure no one attempted to return to their homes. Initially, it was decided that Novozibkov would also be evacuated, and its 40,000 residents were informed of this, but the plan was eventually scrapped when protests were started by people who refused to be forced out of their homes. The name Fabergé is synonymous with quality and wealth as far as design is concerned. Anyone who owns a piece of jewelry made by the House of Fabergé jewelry firm, which was founded by Peter Carl Fabergé, knows that it's highly sought after and likely worth a lot of money. Among some of the most prominent pieces ever created by Fabergé are the famous jeweled Easter eggs that date back to the late 1800s. They were often given out as gifts by Russian Tsars, such as Tsar Alexander III. One of his most prized eggs, which contained a gold hen sitting on golden straw, was given to his wife as a gift in 1885. It also contains a small diamond replica of the imperial crown and a ruby pendant, and when his wife received it, she was said to have been beyond delighted. As a result, Fabergé was appointed as the Tsar's official goldsmith by special appointment, and each year he was commissioned to create more of these themed jeweled eggs. Each one contained a unique surprise inside, and eventually the Tsar had collected a total of 52 eggs, which would have been the equivalent of a fortune. But this treasure would soon be pilfered when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, took control of Russia in 1917 during the October Revolution. Almost immediately, the Tsar's gold jewelry and other treasures were seized and then stored in the Kremlin's armory. Thankfully, Lenin decided not to have these items destroyed or melted down, but in 1927, Joseph Stalin decided to sell the treasures since he was in need of funds. The items were mostly sold individually, and they were bought by collectors from all over the world. Over the years, the treasure was spread far and wide, and the location of the Fabergé eggs remained a mystery for some time. While some of the eggs adorned the houses of wealthy collectors, others were found for sale in pawn shops for a fraction of their real value. One U.S. man struck it rich when he revealed that the egg, which he'd bought for $14,000, was actually worth $33 million, and he revealed that he'd stumbled across it at a small corner shop. Remarkably, he'd planned to disassemble the egg for scrap, and it had been used as a kitchen counter decoration, but before disposing of it, he noticed an inscription on the clock inside the egg and discovered it was worth a lot more than he paid for it. One by one, the eggs were tracked down and returned to their rightful place, but 6 still remain missing today. The task of tracking the eggs down is made all the harder by the fact that some high-quality reproductions have been made over the years, and on several occasions, people have been left disappointed after finding out that they paid thousands of dollars for an egg that was virtually worthless. Among those that are yet to be recovered are the hen with sapphire pendant, the cherub with chariot, the necessaire egg, the mauve egg, the Royal Danish egg, and the 1909 Alexander III commemorative egg. The hunt for these eggs is still underway, and it's hoped that in time, the remaining missing eggs will be found if they've not already been destroyed or disassembled. In the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, scientists realized that the reactor couldn't remain in the state that it was, and the decision was eventually made to have it covered up by a shell that was constructed from concrete and steel. This structure was given the moniker the sarcophagus, and there's no doubt that it helped stop the spread of radiation, but since it was hastily constructed, it contained many flaws, and eventually water started to seep in, causing the shield to start corroding. There were fears that it would eventually collapse, resulting in even more dangerous irradiated debris at the plant, and so the decision was made to have it carefully dismantled. The initial sarcophagus was constructed by no fewer than 600,000 people, who were tasked with ensuring that the 220 tons of radioactive material at the site was properly covered. More than 14 million cubic feet of concrete were used in its construction, along with 16 million pounds of steel. Once it was installed, holes were drilled in the side of the shield so that the core could be observed from the outside. Observers were kept safe from the radiation thanks to filters that were installed in these holes, but it was always going to be a temporary safety measure. Construction of the structure started 2 months after the disaster, and it took 7 months to complete. Unfortunately, workers who were tasked with installing the shield neglected to seal off the building's joints and openings in its ceiling, and these are the areas where the water started to seep in. During the installation, 31 people received lethal doses of radiation and eventually lost their lives. 2 years later, it was revealed by the Soviet government that the sarcophagus was designed to only last for around 20 years, and that a secondary structure would need to be installed in its place. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Ukrainian government launched an international competition to find its best design for the new structure. In 2004, it was announced that a design by British designers would be used, since it contained a sliding arch that could be moved into place with the minimum amount of effort. This would keep workers from being exposed to unnecessary amounts of radiation, and the old structure, as well as the reactor, would be fully covered. 2 French construction groups, collectively known as Novarka, won the contract to build the shell, which was named the New Safe Confinement Structure. It was constructed nearly 1,000 feet away from the reactor after the parts were shipped in from Italy, and once it was completed, it weighed around 32,000 tons. While this was going on, it was discovered that the original sarcophagus's roof was about to collapse, and scaffolding was added to keep it in place. By 2014, the framework of the new shell was moved into place, after which construction of the rest of the shell started, and the project was completed in 2016 and was installed in November of that year. In northern Israel lies a lake known as the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Tiberias. This lake is mentioned in the Bible on several occasions, most notably when Jesus gathered his first disciples, when he walked on water, and when he fed 5,000 people with just 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, and when he calmed a storm on the lake. This last event is the subject of a painting created by the famous artist Rembrandt van Rijn, called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was painted in 1633 and remains the only known depiction of a seascape that he ever created, which makes it extremely valuable. It depicts a small wooden boat caught in a storm on the lake, and the vessel is clearly in peril as its sails are torn, and compared to the massive waves that it's traversing, it seems almost insignificant. The 14 sailors aboard the boat can be seen praying, clearly desperate to make it to land or to somehow be rescued, though that prospect seems highly unlikely. Hence, the expressions on their faces are desperate as they face almost certain doom. A few of the sailors are seen desperately trying to steer the boat to no avail, while others are trying to wake Jesus, who's asleep close to the tiller. 4 of the men are attempting to break the sails back into some kind of order, but thanks to the howling wind, this was an impossible task. It's believed that one of the sailors, who's seen holding onto a rope, was supposed to depict the artist himself, though this has never been proven definitively. It's undoubtedly one of Rembrandt's greatest works, but it's also the subject of a great mystery. In 1990, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where the painting was being held, was the scene of a daring heist. On the 18th of March that year, 13 paintings with a combined value of around $500 million were stolen from the building by two men who had disguised themselves as police officers. They managed to gain entry to the museum by telling the guard on duty that he was about to be arrested thanks to an outstanding warrant. In the resulting confusion, he was placed in cuffs, and when a second guard investigated, he was also cuffed. They then realized that they were actually there to rob the museum, and made their way to an area known as the Dutch Room. Luckily, when they attempted to steal Rembrandt's self-portrait, they found it too heavy and cumbersome, and decided to leave it behind. The other paintings were promptly cut out of their frames before making their getaway, and they were never tracked down. During the resulting investigation, the FBI offered a $5 million reward to anyone who could provide them with information leading to the paintings being recovered, but they remain missing to this day. According to news reports that were released in May of 1986, following the Chernobyl disaster, it wasn't just Pripyat and its neighboring towns that were affected by the released radiation, since it was found that certain parts of Europe were experiencing higher than normal levels of radiation. Just a week after the explosion occurred, every single country in mainland Europe had reported elevated radiation levels. The Iberian Peninsula was prepared for similar readings, but was eventually found to be unaffected. At the time, the entire world was on tenterhooks, since such a disaster had never occurred in our history before, and there was a great deal of uncertainty as to how many countries would be affected. Keep in mind that the first sign of trouble came from readings received in Sweden, more than 930 miles away from the plant, while the Soviet government scrambled to keep the disaster a secret from the rest of the world. When the truth was finally revealed, scientists started keeping an eye on the wind over Kiev and found that it was constantly changing not only in direction but in strength. This made it impossible to immediately estimate the amount of radiation that was being spread over Europe, and it caused a lot of uncertainty. Poland and Scandinavia had been affected by a southwesterly wind that blew in the wake of the explosion, but it soon changed to an easterly wind, and as a result, higher radiation readings were then reported in Greece, southwest Germany, and what was Yugoslavia at the time. France reported that it had seen an increase in atmospheric radioactivity, while the Netherlands decided to shelve its plans to shift to nuclear power after higher than normal readings were discovered there. Poland, East Germany, and Sweden also started to become concerned, and in some areas farmers were told to keep their cattle indoors for the first few weeks, for fear that they would be affected by the released radiation. Residents were told not to drink collected rainwater, and to refrain from eating wild mushrooms and vegetables, since it wasn't yet known how badly they had been affected. Poland was the worst affected of the Eastern European countries, and as panic started to spread, residents started buying iodine and uncontaminated food. Iodine is known to aid in the prevention of radiation contamination. But in West Germany, the government started to warn people to take iodine pills in moderation, since the panic had caused several people to take too many, resulting in iodine poisoning. The government started limiting the supply of fresh milk from the worst affected parts of the country, since the effects of the radiation had not been determined yet. These areas included Bavaria and Hesse, among others. In West Berlin, it was reported that no stock of iodine pills was left, as people scrambled to make sure they had an adequate supply. In Bucharest, citizens were warned to make sure their drinking water was potable before consuming it, and people in Belgrade were told to remain indoors if possible, or to spend as little time outdoors as possible. Romania reported sharp increases in the levels of radiation in the atmosphere, while in Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, citizens were told to ensure their vegetables were properly washed before they were consumed. People in Italy were prohibited from buying or selling salad greens, and many of their imports from Europe were immediately banned. When archaeologists uncover a mystery, it usually doesn't take long for scholars, experts, and historians to figure out what that item was used for or who it was made by. But the same can't be said for a strange item that was discovered in Norfolk, England in 2024. One of the strangest aspects of this item is its size. It measures just 0.8 inches in diameter and 0.4 inches in height, which would have made it easy to miss during an excavation. But luckily, that was not the case. It's decorated with an artistic impression of a horse, and according to those who have inspected it, it was created by someone who had superior skills when it came to metalwork, especially silver, since it would have been very hard to create the intricate designs that adorn it. But historians have been left baffled by what it was used for. It's been suggested that it's a piece of jewelry, but it contains no clasps or hooks that are usually found on those items. It's been described as resembling a small crumpled bottle cap, though it would only just fit on the tip of a person's finger. One historian stated that she was surprised at the level of detail that was used to create an object that seemingly served no purpose. She described the work on it as akin to the care taken by someone who was producing a Bible or a piece of jewelry meant for royalty. She's also suggested that the craftsman responsible for creating the artifact was likely skilled in other areas too. They may have worked on important texts and documents that were adorned with a gliding liquid made from powdered gold, which was then mixed with mercury. She drew this conclusion after analyzing the patterns on the sides of the artifacts, and they were very similar to illuminated manuscripts created around that same time period. Upon conducting further research, experts were able to date the item to the 8th or early 9th century. Due to the decorations used, it's thought to have had some kind of religious significance, but this remains mere speculation. If it is indeed a piece of jewelry, it would have belonged to someone of importance, since silver and gold objects were only adorned by those in power, or people who were wealthy due to their status in their communities. Another baffling aspect is how the object could have been fastened to a chain, clothing, or a larger object. It contains no clasps, hooks, or hoops where a chain could be threaded through, and since its discovery, many suggestions have been made, but its purpose remains unknown. When it became apparent that something was wrong at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on the day of the disaster, staff working at the time were told to take dosimeter readings to ascertain how much radiation was being released into the surrounding atmosphere. Initial readings came back as 3.6 Rontgen, but it was then discovered that those specific dosimeters maxed out at that number, and it quickly became apparent that those readings could not be relied upon. It would later be discovered that the actual reading was closer to 20,000 Rontgens per hour, which is almost an unimaginable amount. Anyone who's exposed to 500 Rontgens is certain to lose their life, as is evidenced by the many people who perished while desperately battling to bring the plant back under control, which turned out to be a futile endeavor. Massive amounts of radioactive material were ejected from the plant thanks to the explosion, more than 400 times more than the material released by the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Furthermore, the Chernobyl explosion contained longer-lived radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and iodine-131, which are responsible for the long-term contamination and health issues in the surrounding areas. These were just two of more than 100 radioactive elements that were released into the atmosphere that day. But luckily, most of these elements are short-lived, and hence were far less dangerous. As a comparison, the explosion at Hiroshima affected an area of around 8 miles from the center of the spot where the atomic bomb was dropped, whereas the Chernobyl explosion affected an area of about 100,000 miles in diameter around the plant. As for the biological effects that this release of radiation has had, which is measured in sieverts per hour, the numbers are startling. In the immediate vicinity of the reactor core, 300 sieverts per hour were released. Full-body exposure of just 8 sieverts per hour, 37 times less, is considered fatal to humans within a few weeks. The heap of debris that fell into the circulation pump area released up to 100 sieverts per hour, and near the electrolyzers, between 500 and 100 sieverts per hour was released. Immediately after the blast, it's estimated that certain areas of Pripyat experienced up to 300 sieverts per hour, and considering that the town's residents were only evacuated days later, this led to many people eventually losing their lives. A study that was performed in 2009 found that the cooling towers at the plant were still releasing up to 1.5 microsieverts per hour in the interior, while the back of the towers were more radioactive, releasing more than 12 microsieverts per hour. The very roads surrounding Reactor 4, the unit that was involved in the meltdown, still give off readings of 2.6 microsieverts per hour. But one of the most dangerous objects that still exists in the Chernobyl forest is the metal claw that was used during cleanup operations. It's still extremely radioactive and has been found to be releasing about 336 microsieverts per hour, decades after the fact. One of the most worrying facts about the claw is that it's been left on the ground in the forest, and several people who have visited the forest, either legally or otherwise, happened upon it without any sort of warning. The true scale of the impact that the Chernobyl disaster had on the surrounding area and some parts of Europe is hard to fathom, mostly because much of the damage caused by the leaked radiation only started presenting itself long after the explosion occurred. Several people lost their lives while combating the fire at the plant and during cleanup operations that took a very long time to complete. But the released radiation was in no way localized, and the long-term effects on the residents of Pripyat, other neighboring towns, and countries as far away as Sweden only became apparent years later. In the first 2 decades that passed following the disaster, an international team of 100 scientists calculated that around 2,000 people lost their lives as a direct result. And in the decade after that, the number fell drastically to about 50. According to a report released by the Chernobyl Forum, as many as 1,000 on-site reactor staff and emergency personnel were exposed to massive amounts of radiation in the first 24 hours following the blast. And in the 12 months following that, 200,000 more were exposed. This resulted in more than 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer being reported over the years, though it should be noted that among those affected, 99% of patients survived. The men and women who risked their lives to make the area as safe as possible should truly be hailed as heroes. But there is further cause for concern, as thousands of people are still living in areas that were contaminated as a result of the accident. Ukraine and Russia were understandably the worst affected in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. But Belarus is also considered to be highly contaminated by radiation, and it's estimated that around 5 million people live in the areas in that country that can be considered risky. At least 100,000 residents live in areas that have been classified as under strict control, but it's been suggested that this classification may be outdated and that these numbers need to be revised. Most of the people received relatively low doses of full-body radiation exposure, and according to several studies, no evidence has been found that this has had an effect on fertility or that it's caused any increase in congenital malformations. When the Soviet Union finally admitted to the true scale of the accident, more than 116,000 people were evacuated from the worst affected areas, and a further 230,000 were forced to flee lesser affected areas in the weeks that followed. But by this time, the radiation had already started taking its toll. The relocation efforts proved to be very traumatic to those who were forced out of their homes, and thanks to myths about what would happen to those who remained in contaminated areas, some people started suffering from paralyzing fatalism. This means that they would feel that there's little that could be done to improve their situation, since they've been falsely led to believe that their fates have been sealed. The symptoms of this state of mind include a lack of ambition and display an uncommon amount of apathy. The psychological effects that the disaster has had on people affected by it are clear, but they've also had to deal with the possibility of future health issues, such as cataracts and cardiovascular diseases. Some of the most perplexing mysteries that continue to baffle historians are artifacts that have been uncovered, and which seem to make no sense. In some cases, they're called out-of-place artifacts, but in others, they're perplexed by the fact that these items have remained well-preserved for thousands of years against all odds. One such artifact is called the Sword of Gujian, and has been dated to around 2,500 years ago. It was discovered while a team of archaeologists was working along the Zhang River in China. The purpose of the excavations was to unearth a series of tombs that had been uncovered. But while this work was being carried out, they came across a most unexpected artifact among 2,000 others that were removed and preserved. But the sword of Gujian was by far the most impressive. It was found alongside the remains of someone whose coffin had been badly water damaged. The casket had been in the ground for more than 1,000 years, and hence they found it remarkable that the sword was in such good condition. It's thought that thanks to the excellent craftsmanship of the sword, including its scabbard, which was almost watertight, the blade was protected from the underground water that damaged the casket and other natural elements. The blade measures 22 inches in length, and it contains a hilt measuring 3.3 inches. When it was removed from its scabbard, the blade was virtually perfect, and by many accounts still sharp enough to cut through 20 sheets of paper. The blade itself is made mostly of copper, but it was found to also contain small amounts of tin. The guard is decorated with turquoise and blue crystals, and when the sword was dated, it was found to have been crafted between 771 and 403 BC, which made the condition in which it was in even more extraordinary. Upon inspection, experts found that it contained 8 characters on the blade, and they got to work to decipher what these symbols meant. 6 of the characters explained that the sword was made for the king of Yua, and it was made for his personal use. But this led to a further conundrum. During the period in which the sword was made, as many as 9 different people ruled over the area known as Yua. The only option was to inspect the coffin in which it was discovered, as well as the remains of the person with whom it was found. After this was done, it was ascertained that the blade belonged to Gujian, who's known to have been the king of Yua between 496 and 465 BC. He was known to be a good king who didn't place himself above others because of his high standing. He'd also gained a reputation for his ability to forge ahead during troubling times in his kingdom, often resorting to eating food meant for the common folk, rather than indulging when they were struggling to survive, as was the case with many other monarchs throughout history. It's been suggested that the sword was made for Gujian in honor of his humility and the fact that he remained close to his kingdom's people as far as his standing was concerned. Unfortunately, when the sword was loaned out to be displayed in Singapore, it suffered a crack when a worker attempted to remove it from a display case. It has since remained in China and will likely never be loaned out again as a result. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.